you, Professor Gao, for joining our program. Professor Henry Gao is from Singapore Management University. His expertise are in international trade law and China's trade practice. Thank you, Professor Gao, for taking the weekend to join us.
Sure, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right, let's start with the breaking news. The latest purge of the Communist Party's Central Military Commission. What's your assessment of the situation? It seems quite an unprecedented situation where only two members are left in the world's second largest military controlling body.
Sure, I think that the recent purge of General Zhang Youxia, who is the vice chairman of the Central Military Commission, and Liu Zhenli, who's a member of the Central Military Commission, has significantly raised the internal uncertainty in the People's Liberation Army and also in China itself. So with this change, I am of the view that an attack on Taiwan is very unlikely in the short term, at least. Of course, this doesn't eliminate the risk of an invasion of Taiwan, but it sharply increased the probability of a failure for any near-term operation. So after the purge, I would expect that there would be new promotions, but in the new promotion, what would be prioritized would be political loyalty rather than military competence. So this means that, whether or not the PLA is really prepared for an invasion on Taiwan, that would remain to be an open question. At least whoever, comes in charge after this would have to familiarize himself with the army. And before that can be done, I don't think an invasion on Taiwan would be possible.
Didn't all these previous generals were already chosen by Xi himself in the previous round due to their personal loyalty? How can we have come to this in the end?
Well, that is the problem. The logic of dictatorship, as I shared on Twitter or X, is that the more concentrated the power is for the top leader, the more paranoid he would be. So that is why we are seeing all this constant non-stop purge. So whoever is going to be the next vice chairman of the Central Military Commission would also become the next target. So, that is because it is impossible for he to do everything by himself. He has to share the power, but the more power he shares with whoever comes next, the more paranoid he would become. And therefore, he would reach one point where he would stop trusting that guy and try to purge that guy. So basically, we are seeing a kind of a vicious circle. And because of the logic of the dictatorship, there's no way that this could stop.
And so how do we assess the situation where like 80% of the Central Military Commission are, according to the official statement, are corrupt? That's highly unusual in terms of like there's unprecedented if you compare any other major power. We've never seen a situation like this where the top echelons of the military leadership have repeatedly been charged with corruption. Is this a structural problem of the Chinese system?
Yeah, this is definitely a systemic and a structural problem with the Chinese system. And it's not just the army. It's ironically because the whole system is a top-down system, right? Where you have the top leader, and then, he has subordinates, and his subordinates also have subordinates, and so on. So if you want to get promoted, you basically have to show your loyalty to whoever is your superior. And how do you demonstrate your loyalty? Well, the best way of demonstrating loyalty is bribing your superior, right? So I heard from some friends that, for example, in the Chinese army, if you want to get promoted, they even have open price tags, right, for different ranks of officers. So if you want to get promoted in the system, you have to be corrupt. So basically, the whole system is producing corrupted officers. So I'm not surprised by the 80% figure. I personally think that 80% is probably too low. If I think if they are doing, a thorough investigation, they would find out that probably 100% of the officers are corrupt. The only people who are uncorrupt are the soldiers, who just want to serve their term and then retire. But the officers, I think they are probably almost 100% corrupt.
So you mentioned that you think this latest purge will affect the schedule of the possible military action on Taiwan, but there is an alternative theory circulating online I've seen today, which is quite convincing also that it's the older generation of the generals. They are different ideologically compared to the new more wolf warrior like newer younger generation because the younger generation grew up with the last 20 years of China's rapid economic development and the political dominance and rising status around the world. So these type of young generals will be much more prone to be ideologically aligned with the so-called wolf warrior ideology, which means that they are much more confident of China's ability to take Taiwan by force. And what do you think of that possible scenario where this is an opportunity for the younger, more pro-war generations to join the leadership and which makes a military action more likely in the near term?
Well, this is analysis, I think, is only half correct. It is true that the younger officers are more eager to, get promoted, right? And the fastest way of getting promoted is a war, right? But unless he is willing to promote somebody who is in his 30s or at most 40s to the rank of the vice chairman of the Central Military Commission, or even just a member of the Central Military Commission, I don't think it would happen, right? Because if you are in your 30s or 40s, the highest you could be, would be maybe a regional commander, but you have to be at least in your 50s to be promoted to the Central Military Commissions. And as I just explained, because China is a top-down system, so it depends on who's at the top. And the Chinese system is such that you have to be old enough before you can be promoted to the top, right? Especially in the military. So I only agree with the first half of the analysis, but I think it started from the correct premises, but it reached the wrong conclusion.
There is also this view from a lot of analysts that the next 3 years are a very precious opportunity for the Chinese leadership because they have Donald Trump in the White House, who is a very transactional figure. He's not ideological, so his view towards Taiwan are much more transactional than any other U.S. presidents in history, and it's likely he's willing to sell off Taiwan when the price is right, if he can reach a so-called good deal with President Xi. So in that sense, how do you assess the possibility of the next 3 years with Trump in the office, whether this opens a window for China to take action?
Well, I don't buy that argument because, first of all, if you read the national security strategy of the US, which was just released a few months ago, you could see that the US does place a lot of emphasis on Taiwan because it realized the so-called First Island chain, plays a key role in containing China. So I think Trump can say whatever he wants. I mean, his style is that he says a lot of things, which doesn't make sense. But you cannot just take this sense at face value. A lot of times, what he says simply to confuse the opponent,
Yeah.
so that he could get the best deal for the U.S. So I don't believe that he might be given a few loose remarks regarding Taiwan means that he's willing to give up on Taiwan. When China really moves on Taiwan, I think the calculations will be very different. And even if you argue that he's a transactional president, he might be willing to give up Taiwan, but the price would be very high. And then for Xi, this is something that he doesn't like, to bargain on. So I doubt that, even if Trump, let's say, gives Xi a deal, Xi would be willing to take the bargain. We have already seen that in Trump's, dealing with Putin, for example, right, in the Ukraine situation, right? He did propose something to Putin, but Putin always reject the deal. So that is Trump's approach. He would make, a proposal that actually he knew that the other party would not take on. So I think we are probably going to be in a similar situation with regard to Taiwan, where even if, let's say, when China moves on Taiwan, the U.S. propose a deal. The deal would be very hard for Xi to accept, right? Because as we all know, Xi really likes to save his face, and accepting the deal might be too face losing for him to accept. So I don't really think that on the Taiwan issue, the U.S. will give it up so easily.
Um, we've seen China just concluded a so-called military drill around Taiwan last month. It effectively blocked the whole island for like a week, and it's proof that, and also from the previous drills, it kind of shows that China has the military capacity to at least blockade Taiwan for a certain period of time. So, what U.S. action do you think can deter, like, in a comparable military power, China does seems to have gaining power, at least around the Taiwan Strait. The U.S. still quite far away from actually projecting its power to the Taiwan Strait. So in that sense, isn't that inevitable? Someday this will gonna happen, and China will have the upper hand. They probably don't even have to fire a single shot. They just can just blockade the whole thing. Is
Well, I have to say, war is different than a drill, right? I mean, look at the U.S. action, in Venezuela, right? They didn't do any drill, right? But they just carry out the action, right? So I think China could do, hundreds of drills, but when it comes to war, it's totally different.
okay. Let's move on to the next question. Um, what do you think is China's economic power and political power and the military power? How do you assess the success of this political model in the last 20 or 30 years, like make China the second superpower? Isn't that prove that the success of the Chinese authoritarian system with a capitalist element? And how does that compare to, say, India with a similar size country, but with a democratic system?
Well, as I have argued in some of my articles, if you look at the Chinese model, you could see that China has this economic miracle, right? This double-digit growth rate and so on. But if you that is just a kind of a overall impression. If you put it under closer examination, you will see that the Chinese model is actually not what it appears. Of course, after 4 decades of reform and economic development, China has accumulated a lot of material wealth. But the distribution of wealth is quite uneven in the sense that a lot of wealth are still concentrated in the hands of the party, the state-owned enterprises rather than in the people. And that explains why the Chinese model is unsustainable because ultimately, when you become the number two or even one day, let's say the number one largest economy in the world, you cannot rely on exports, right? Because you produce so many products, and not many countries around the world can absorb, all these exports from you. So you have to find a way to absorb the extra production capacity domestically. And the problem with the Chinese model is that because of the unequal distribution of wealth, so most of the people actually have very little income, right? So as the former Premier Li Keqiang famously said, right, there are 600 million people in China who earns less than I couldn't remember the exact number, but
A thousand yuan per month, is it? I think.
yeah, a
Yeah.
thousand yuan per month. So that would be roughly less than $5 per month, right? In that case, I mean, most of the people can only have enough income to sustain themselves, right? And they do not have extra income to buy all these surplus products which are produced by the Chinese system. So that is the dilemma of the Chinese system. They rely too much on the exports. And all these exports, because they are so cheap, right? They are so cheap because they pay the workers really very low wages, and they do not really implement their own environmental regulations. They do not enforce these environmental regulations. So in the long run, it is unsustainable because when you export to the other countries, this would basically destroy the domestic industries in many of these countries, including the US, right? Because in the US, you have to pay the workers a decent wage, you have to comply with environmental regulations, and so on. So there's no way you can compete with them. So that explains Trump's trade war against China, basically, where he started imposing the high tariffs, which forced China to shift their exports to the other countries. But if the US, which account for about one third of the total consumption in the world, cannot handle the exports from China, the other countries also cannot absorb all this extra surplus capacity. So that is why, China, as I understand from my friends in China who are doing, foreign trade, life have really been difficult for them for the past few years because of the trade war. But that illustrates the limits of the Chinese model. I mean, if you look at the Indian model, people in China have been laughing at India because they are saying that India is very slow in growth. But in the long term, if you compare India and China, you could argue that India's approach could be more sustainable, right? To give you just one very simple example, that is the issue of birth control. We all know of the disastrous consequences of China's one-child policy, which has resulted in China's birth rate plunging to the lowest level in 280 years, 288 years, according to the economist Dr. Yi Fuxian, who researched on this issue extensively. But if you look at India, actually, India also tried to implement the same birth control policy, but because they had a democratic system, so they basically stopped the birth control policy after only a few years. And that didn't, resulted in the terrible drop in birth rate as you see in China. So I think this simple comparison illustrates the strengths and weaknesses of the Chinese and the Indian system. If you look at the Indian system, it is slow in the short run, but in the long run, it might be more sustainable. The Chinese system is very fast in the short run, but in the long run, you might regret that you get what you wish for.
You have been critical of Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's speech and the Canada's upcoming pivot to what they call the strategic partnership with China. How does that compare to with say Singapore's approach? I see some similarities. Singapore is kind of straddled between the two great powers, China and the US. Would you agree that this is quite a similar approach where you have to extract benefit from your relationship with both great powers rather than just relying on one?
Well, Singapore is very different from Canada because in Singapore, if you look at Singapore's trade, actually most of the Singapore's trade are, petrol, right? So Singapore is one of the largest oil refining centers in the world. So most of the exports of Singapore are actually in fuel and petrochemicals. So for these exports, actually, most countries do not have tariffs. But Canada is different. Canada has a large manufacturing sector, right? And they are also one of the only two neighboring countries of the US. So with Canada, the problem is that one, they might become a kind of overseas manufacturing hub for China. And second, most importantly, because of the proximity with the US, they might become a place for China to transship their products from China to the US through Canada. And that is actually what you saw in the first Trump administration, where even though Trump raised the tariffs against China, China then started to transship its products through third countries to the US. And you saw a lot of transshipment through Southeast Asia. I mean, not through Singapore, because Singapore actually has strict rules regarding transshipment, but instead through countries like Vietnam, like Cambodia, and so on, and also through countries like Mexico. And this basically explains what's going on with Trump's Liberation Day tariffs. Actually, when the Liberation Day tariff was first announced, a lot of people were surprised that the U.S. Imposed high tariffs against some of his allies, right? And countries like Cambodia and Vietnam are subject to tariffs as high as 49%, right? So people were really angry. And I told my friends in Europe and in the other countries at that time that actually the Liberation Day tariffs are not personal with any country. You guys are just a collateral damage in Trump's grand trade war with China. Because as I mentioned earlier, right, so in the first trade war, in the first Trump administration, China exploited the loophole of all these transshipment and simply transshipped its products through these third countries to the US. So Trump wanted to seal the loophole in his second term. And the way of doing that is to reason the tariff against every country, right? So, if China is transshipping it through a third country and the tariff of the third country is 15% or 30%, right? Then there's no point of transshipping it through a third country, right? So that is one purpose of the Liberation Day tariff. The second purpose of the Liberation Day tariff is to use it as a leverage to force these countries to join the US in taking action against China's trade practices. So again, if you compare Trump's first term with his second term, in the first term, what he tried to do is to rally the allies to join the US against China on the trade front. There were the so-called trilateral group discussion among the US, US, EU, and Japan. So these are the three countries. But then in the end, it didn't really work out. They held a lot of discussion, but not really coordinated action, right? Because as we could see, for example, the EU still tried to cozy up the relationship with China. So Trump changed the approach. So this time around, he used the Liberation Day tariff as a way to force these countries to negotiate with the US. And I actually predicted right after Liberation Day that when Trump, well, first of all, I predicted that Liberation Day tariff is going to be used as a leverage to force these countries to negotiate with the US. And second, I also predicted that these agreements, these new agreements signed by the US, will include a lot of provisions against China, especially against the transshipment practices of China. So indeed, if you see that the agreements that the US has concluded later, including with the UK, which is one of the first, and including with the Southeast Asian countries like Cambodia and Indonesia and Malaysia and so on, later last year, you do see a lot of provisions targeting transshipment, supply chain security, and tariff evasion. And all of these provisions are basically dealing with China. So basically, Trump is using Liberation Day tariff to force a change in the rules of world trade against China. But the approach by Canada is very dangerous because it creates a kind of a crack in the alignment of the allied countries vis-a-vis China that China could exploit and basically resort to the same old tactics of divide and rule as in the past. So that is why I'm of the view that the Canadian approach actually is not the correct approach. It is a short-sighted because I think for Canada, China would be much more dangerous, right? Because I mean. China with China, I don't think Canada is really ready for their trade relationship with China. I wouldn't be surprised actually in the next few months that there would be more frictions, new frictions between Canada and China. Because in the long term, if you look at the long-term interests, actually Canada has more alignment with the US in terms of long-term interests. Of course, Trump doesn't talk nicely, right? He always make all these, crazy remarks regarding, for example, making Canada the 51st state and so on, which makes him unpopular in Canada. But I think Canadian politicians, if they really care about the long-term interests of Canada, they should think carefully as to whether or not they really want to embrace China because they have engaged in trade wars with China in the past, right? Over many issues, clonal oil, over electric vehicles, and so on. And I would not be surprised if these are repeated again in the future.
Yeah, but you can't really blame Canada because Trump himself has trash talking Canada, as you mentioned, and that really affect his public standing in Canada. And in a democratic society, the leadership has to listen to the electorate, right? And the Canadian people are angry, and they seem to have realized that their relationship with US is permanently damaged. I mean, Trump, it may not be isolated event. It reflects a growing trend inside US about isolationism, and this is probably just the most obvious example exploded into the scene by Trump. So in that sense, it isn't that China is prudent to hedge its own bet, like with the two greatest power, and to forge an economic relationship with China.
Well, of course, in democratic societies, the politicians have to listen to the people, right? And do what the people tell them to do. But I think the distinction between a politician and a great statesman like Winston Churchill is that a great statesman will know what is the long-term interest of the country and guide the people, right? Okay, so that is the key difference. So if the Canadian leader is someone with, long-term vision, he should realize that his country's interests, long-term interests, lies with the U.S., not with China, right? And making all these gestures with China would only endanger the perception, the relationship with the U.S. and cause the U.S. to review China as review Canada as an unreliable partner. So that is not actually good for the long-term interests of Canada. So I do think that if Carney were a great politician, he would know how to talk to the people, how to educate the people, how to try to persuade them what is the really in the long-term interests. But he didn't do that. He just catered to whatever is the whim of the people at the moment, right? That I don't think is what a great statesman should do.
You mentioned just now that Trump's goal is to use a coalition of countries to force China to change its trade practice. But didn't Trump's tactics, like alienating all the potential coalition members right now? He's threatening to annex Greenland. He's trash talking Europe, trash talking Canada. He signed a free trade agreement himself with Canada and Mexico, and now he's torn it up. How can any ally trust Trump in their new agreement when he can just destroy the agreement at any whim? And isn't that Trump himself to blame if this strategy doesn't work?
Well, I actually disagree with the premise of this review because this review seems to assume that before Trump, there was no discontent within the Western alliance, right? Even before Trump, actually there were already a lot of cracks within the Western bloc, right? You see this clearly if you look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? Europe has failed for 4 years to make any meaningful response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, even though that is the most blatant violation of international law in decades. If they really regard themselves as worthy allies of the U.S., what they should have done is to, beef up their, national defense spending, providing more help to Ukraine rather than relying on the U.S. to support Ukraine. So I think the all these complaint against the U.S. is a little bit disingenuous. I mean, if you want to earn the respect of your allies, you yourself have to put in some effort. And I honestly do not see much effort from the side of the EU, for example. The EU, of course, complained that China, is supporting Russia in this war. But at the same time, the EU also still wants to cozy up with China, wanted to, increase the cooperation with China, and they are still buying indirectly. They're all from Russia. So I think if you want to argue, who's the first one who kind of betrayed the allies, I don't think you should point the finger at the U.S.
Okay, so you are a legal academic. What do you assess the legal foundation of Trump's tariff? The Supreme Court decision is pending, and there is a 50-50 chance, at least at the moment, that they're going to rule that the Trump doesn't have the actual authority to use the emergency power to impose a tariff. What happens if the only weapon Trump has been ruled illegal by the Supreme Court?
Well, no, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, or the IEPA, which Trump has cited to support his Liberation Day tariffs. First of all, that is not the only legal basis for his tariff actions. Even if that is overruled by the Supreme Court, Trump still has many other legal tools that he could use to impose tariff against the other countries, like Section 301, Section 232, for example. So there are so many legal provisions he could resort to. I think even if the Supreme Court rules against Trump, I don't think that would change much because secondly, Trump could also use all these bilateral agreements which he has signed with a lot of these countries as the basis for the additional tariff. So I don't think even if the Supreme Court rules against the Trump tariffs, that would be the end of the tariffs. I think Trump could simply just choose another legal provision or simply point to the bilateral agreements that he signed. And plus, as I mentioned, actually the Liberation Day tariffs is not the end. It is only a means. Does Trump really care whether Vietnam, for example, has 20% tariff against U.S. Exports or a 0% tariff against U.S. exports? For most of the countries, it doesn't matter that much because for most of the countries, the U.S. exports to these countries are so small to matter. What Trump really cares is that these countries would join the U.S. effort in erecting the tariff war against China. And he has already achieved that in all these bilateral deals, as I mentioned earlier. So whether or not this is ruled illegal by the Supreme Court, it doesn't matter that much.
Trump himself has insisted all along that the foreign countries are paying for the tariff. Do you agree with that? Economists will say that that's not true, simply not true.
Yes, I disagree with the view that the foreign countries are paying tariffs. I think if you look at classical economic theory, the consensus is that the consumers would be paying the tariffs. But the interesting thing is that 1 year after Liberation Day tariffs, we haven't really seen, a
Huge
huge
spike. No.
inflation right in the US right now. So there are many reasons for that. I think, it would be interesting to figure out what is really going on. So I think even though what Trump said doesn't make economic sense, but he seems to have a way to make it work so that the tariff effects are not translated into inflation.
Now let's move on to geopolitics. The latest international kerfuffle over Greenland, isn't that a naked imperialist territorial grab by Trump, breaking all the rules that the US is supposed to hold for the last 70, 60 years?
Well, on Greenland, I think Trump's rhetoric and all this loose language regarding Greenland should really be understood primarily as a negotiation strategy rather than as a naked territorial ambition, right? So, and also I find it, a bit disingenuous, as I mentioned, of all these strong reactions against the U.S. on Greenland, when the EU itself has failed, as I mentioned earlier, to act on Russian invasion of Ukraine for 4 years. And on that issue, there's no question, right? That is blatant invasion. Russia never provided an option for Ukraine, right, to sell the land to Russia. They just took it by force. So I think is kind of a luxury to try to moralize about cohesion of the Western alliance when Europe has failed for 4 years to act on Ukraine. If the U.S. Allies cannot act collectively against actual aggression, even in the extreme cases like the Ukraine situation. It is unreasonable to demand that the U.S. Would forego, threat to its own national security in the name of hypothetical unity, because Greenland does have a strategic importance, and it does. I mean, if you look at the map, right, the closest country to Greenland, other than Canada, is Russia,
Russia.
right? So the U.S. does have a legitimate concern, and Europe has proven that itself is unable to act, right? Even in the case of blatant invasion, like in the case of Ukraine. So the U.S. has to take action, right?
So you said this is all a negotiating tool by Trump, but the tool to achieve what? Does he actually want to annex Greenland or what?
I'm not privy to that discussion, so I don't know what is the end goal. But I think at least the U.S. would want meaningful control of Greenland to prevent some potential infiltration in Greenland by Russia or China to
But
use it as a tool against U.S.
But doesn't the US already have access to Greenland in terms of military agreement? They can send troops, they can establish bases there, they can install missile system. Everything has already been agreed upon in the previous agreement with Denmark. Seems to me it's all these grandstanding is just unnecessarily alienating the European allies with no benefit at all.
Well, had Europe proven itself to be more effective in deterring Russia in the war on Ukraine, I don't think the US would feel the need to take action. But since the Europe has proven itself to be, so ineffective, that is why the US has to take one step further, right? So I think we have to connect the dots together, right? I mean, the EU can not just complain that the US is taking this drastic action when in the last 4 years they have failed to do what an US ally would be supposed to do, right? So now the US is taking its own action. They are complaining against the US. I fail to see the logic here.
Okay. Trump himself a few weeks ago promised that he gonna intervene in Iran if the Iranian regime continue to kill the protesters, but he hasn't done anything so far. So isn't that a betrayal of the Iranian protesters?
Well, first of all, the U.S. as a country does not have a moral duty towards another country, right? Actually, had Trump acted on Iran, I think a lot of people are going to,
Condemn him. Mhm.
complain that the U.S. is violating the sovereignty of Iran, right? I mean, that is the irony that we are seeing now. Actually, all of these tasks should be done by the United Nations, right? Which was designed to do exactly this kind of a situation, right? To basically prevent, regimes like Iran, like Venezuela, from basically violating the human rights of its own people. But because of the power structure of the United Nations, right, where you have the Security Council and you have a permanent members like Russia and China, which has been constantly blocking meaningful action by the UN, even in the most extreme cases, right, like a Russian invasion of Ukraine, right, like blatant human rights violations, right? So when collective security collapses, the responsibility would shift to capable states. And in such a case, you cannot really say that the US has a moral obligation towards any country. I mean, because as you mentioned earlier, the US as a democracy, the leaders do not have the luxury of just wasting their resources on every emergency around the world. Their priority first and foremost is to their own people, right? So whether the U.S. would act on Iran or not, I think would depend first and foremost upon whether or not the U.S. government, that is led by President Trump, decide whether that is in the interest of the U.S. to do so, right? And I don't think other countries can really blame the U.S. for doing or not doing anything.
But didn't that mean that Trump should hold his mouth about promising the protester that he's going to send bombers? That turns out to be not true. And as you mentioned, the MAGA ideology is firmly against foreign intervention, especially in the Middle East. So this is like a core promise Trump made to his base. And in terms of with that in mind, it will be highly it was highly irresponsible for him to make a public promise to the protesters. His words carried
Well,
consequences.
Well, I don't think so. I think that for when we judge politicians, we shouldn't judge him by his words, right? Because they can promise you everything, right? They can promise you heaven on earth, which is what a lot of politicians are doing nowadays. But you have to judge them by their actions and the consequences of these actions. So I think it's too early to say, what the U.S. has or has done, has not done anything regarding Iran.
Okay. Well, let's talk about Trump's action. The the capture of Maduro and this relationship with the international law. How do you think, as a legal academic, how do you think it stacks up in terms of international law to be sending a military force into another country and capturing its leader?
Okay, so many people have written on this to say that this is a violation of the UN Charter, especially Article 2.4, right, on the prohibition on the use of force against the sovereign states. But I do not think that the issue is really that simple because even though lay people might regard Article 2.4 as an absolute prohibition on the use of force against the sovereign states, in practice, it is more nuanced than that. First of all, the article prohibits force against the territorial integrity or political independence of a state, right? So if you look at the US operation, it was narrowly targeted at removing a single individual, right?
It's
Maduro
probably with the
himself.
cooperation of the Venezuelan military, probably.
Yes, so there was no territorial annexation, no regime change, right, imposed by occupation, and no attempt to dismantle the Venezuelan state. In fact, right, the existing domestic institutions were largely left intact, right, and we even had the former vice president Rodriguez, right, being left as the now head of the state. So there was no alternative government installed by the US. Second, the UN Charter protection only provide protection to the states, but not to the head of the state himself, right? So if you look at Maduro, his claim to presidency actually lacks legitimacy, both from a domestic constitutional perspective in Venezuela and also at the international level. So when he stole the election in 2018, more than 50 states, and these include the US, the EU, Canada, the UK, and even the Organization of American States. All these countries actually, or international organizations, they refuse to recognize him as Venezuela's lawful president, right? I mean, he's not some guy who was democratically elected. And third, Article 2.4 of the UN Charter must be read together with Article 1.3. Article 1 basically set out the purposes of the UN, and one of the purposes is the promotion of human rights and fundamental freedoms of the people, right? So this is one of the most fundamental purposes of the UN because ultimately, why we set up the UN is to protect the people, it's not to protect some dictators, right? So if you have a regime that is built on systemic repression, mass displacement, and electoral fraud, such a regime cannot plausibly claim that it can have the shield of Article 2.4 while violating the very purposes that justifies Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, right? So that would defeat the purpose, the whole purpose of the UN. So I do not think that that the U.S. action, if you examine it carefully, means that we have the end of international law.
But there were many friends of the United States are of not very desirable regimes. Some even have worse human rights records than Venezuela. And a lot of especially the Middle Eastern allies of the US, they have terrible human rights records. But you don't see the United States snatching their leader, overthrowing their government, not even elected like Saudi Arabia or the Sultan states. So if if human rights is a core excuse to launch this action, what about those U.S. allies at the moment?
Again, as I mentioned earlier, that is more of a failure of the UN and the international system rather than of the US. Because sanctioning these states should have been the responsibility of the United Nations, right? But because the way the UN operates, it has failed to take action with regard to these states. And you can't really blame the US because the US, is not the UN, right? It does have a responsibility towards every state. And whether the US choose to take action in one state or the other would depend on the national interests of the US, right?
But didn't the US itself adopted similar blocking tactics at the Security Council, say in terms of Israel's war in Gaza? You can't really blame Russia or China using their veto power when the US also frequently uses its own veto power to block international consensus action on Gaza.
Well, the US, of course, is not perfect, right? I'm not saying that the US is perfect. I'm just saying that the UN system is ineffective in such a way that any of the five permanent members of the Security Council can block meaningful action on the part of the UN. So that is why I argued in my article in the for the CG, the Center for International Governance and Innovation, that actually what Trump is doing in Venezuela is to stress test international law, to make the international law more resilient so that they can take action against such states when it is a time to do so, right? So I think this is a meaningful first step, right? We need a new type of international system that is more effective because if it is not, then everybody could become a potential victim.
If you think the US is justified in snatching another country's leader on drug charges, what if China sent a special ops to capture President Lai on domestic, say, sedition charges? Wouldn't be on exactly the same logic that applying domestic law to a relationship with other political entities?
No, there are big differences at two levels. So first, at the individual level, as I mentioned, Maduro was not elected president of Venezuela, right? Instead, he stole the election, right? So most people would agree to that. But President Lai of Taiwan, he was a democratically elected president, right? So that is totally different. And second, at the level of international law, right? You could argue that the U.S. action in Venezuela is a matter of violation of international law because Venezuela is another sovereign state. But China never regarded Taiwan as a sovereign state. It has always said that Taiwan issue is an internal affair. And actually, whenever other countries are saying that the Taiwan issue is an international law issue, China has been very angry. So I don't think they would provide any inspiration to China on Taiwan. And I think the only reason why China has not done so is not because it has not found a precedent like the U.S. Action in Venezuela to justify itself also doing it. It is only because China is not able to do it, right? They have actually tried, I think, last year or the year before, if I remember correctly, there was an attempt to, create a kind of car accident on the vice president of Taiwan when
In Europe,
she
yeah.
visited, Eastern Europe. So I don't think China has not been trying; they just couldn't do it.
Before the capture of Maduro, the US military has been conducting military operations in the open sea near Venezuela and killing up to 200 alleged drug traffickers. The US called this action a military, like a war. So, and then the excuse is that in a war, they are enemy combatants, right? So the US has the right to kill them on the spot. But doesn't that contradict with the action on Maduro, uh, who is the leader of the same drug trafficking group, but the US is relying on law enforcement rationale to capture him, but killing all those other ordinary people who have no legal resources. Their family has no way to appeal the decision because their loved ones are dead.
Well, I'm not familiar with the U.S. actions, in the sea. I haven't looked into the details, so I can't really comment on that. But on the comparison with Maduro, as I mentioned earlier, he's not a head of a state because he was not properly elected. He stole the election. So when you talk about immunity to a head of a state, that doesn't apply to him.
Okay, so that goes to the next question. In U.S. domestic law, there is this famous memo by the Justice Department recommending not to indict any sitting U.S. president because of some creative way of interpreting the Constitution and executive power. But that's create a very strange situation where the Southern District of New York can indict a Venezuelan president, but not a U.S. president. So how is that? Doesn't that defy common sense? We're not talking even about talking about legal theories, but just common sense.
Again, as I mentioned earlier, Maduro was not a sitting president in any legally meaningful sense, right? Because he himself didn't respect Venezuela's own constitution when he stole the election.
Uh, okay, all right. So in previous cases, like in
And
Panama, mhm.
if you have to compare the situation with the U.S., I know many people doesn't like Trump, but he was properly elected, right? Nobody claimed that the election that they elected him was a fraud election, right?
Well,
Nobody challenged the
he
legitimate
himself
process.
claimed the U.S. election system is full of fraud.
But for the presidential election, I haven't seen any, proper legal challenge against the presidential election that took place in 2024 yet.
Yeah. Okay. So let's move on to the next question. You seems to suggest that capture of Maduro complies with the spirit of the international law in terms of human rights violations and restoring democracy. But what we have seen, as you mentioned, that the vice president is now the president. The Venezuelan military and the regime is still in place. So there's no regime change. There's no improvement in the Venezuelans' life and democratic rights. There's no election in the near term. We don't see any mention. But Trump frequently mentioned the Venezuelan oil, and that's his seems to be his only justification because he himself can't stop talking about it. So in terms of international law, what legal basis does U.S. have to seize the Venezuela oil assets and then set up an offshore account in Qatar to process the revenue? Isn't that against both international and U.S. domestic law because the power of the purse lies with the U.S. Congress. The president can't just simply set up a bank account for himself or for his administration.
Well, there are two things here. If you look at the U.S. Constitution, I think you are right that in terms of the budget power that is with the U.S. Congress, right? But what we are seeing here is the president's action in a foreign country. So the Constitution grants actually extensive power for so-called foreign power to the president. So that I don't think is subject to any meaningful challenge by the Congress. So I think the issues are different, and also I think what the U.S. is doing without changing the government in Venezuela is because they realize that it is more important to have a stability in the country rather than just fulfilling some lofty ideals of democracy and so on. The real question is if the opposition leader, becomes the president, whether she could, meaningfully control the country. You could have a situation where, there will be military coups in the country, and this would result in more losses of life, right? Which would be bad for everyone. So I think what the U.S. is doing now is to try to stabilize the situation, and I think sooner or later, I will see the U.S. is trying to push for democratic elections, for real elections, right? Where there would be a legitimate government that is elected, and then there would be transition of a power. I mean, both political power and also economic power to this new government. The funds would be returned to the recognized government. So I would say that the temporary holding of these assets does not negate sovereignty, does not deny Venezuela's sovereignty. It simply preserves the sovereignty of Venezuela from criminal capture by somebody like Maduro.
Okay. All right. One last question. Trump is going to Beijing in April. What do you expect the Trump and Xi gonna achieve in their meeting? Is any potential deal on the table?
Well, I don't see really the possibility of reaching any meaningful deal in such a short period of time. I've been seeing, since Liberation Day that even though China would retaliate at the beginning, but China would sit down to the US to negotiate, which was again affirmed by later developments. But I am also of the view that the differences between the two countries is so big that we are unlikely to see any meaningful agreement within a shorter period of time. I would say that the earliest they could reach an agreement would be sometime around the end of this year. Okay, or we could see even it is taking even longer for them to reach agreement. So I think. Even if Trump goes to Beijing in April, I mean, with the situation in China right now, I'm not sure he's going to make the trip, right?
Mhm.
Maybe he would postpone or even cancel the trip. But even if he could go to Beijing in April, I do not expect any major agreement between the two.
But would you agree that compared to other countries who have very few cards against the US, China, as the second economic power in the world, does have a lot of cards to play, like they did play with the rare earth export control and also with the purchase of the US soybeans, and that seems to have worked really on Trump's vulnerabilities. So in that sense, it's China can strike a deal that is beneficial to itself, right?
Beneficial to the party. I'm not sure whether it's beneficial to the people. Okay, and also I disagree that China really have the cards because rare earth, for example, I think is a card that should only be used at the last minute, and China use it actually prematurely. And that card can only be played once, and China already showed its hands. So I don't think China could play the rare earth card again meaningfully in the future. So I think as I mentioned earlier, the problem with the Chinese economic system is a systemic problem. Unless there is a meaningful change to the way the wealth is distributed, which is ultimately a political problem, I don't think China could solve the problem. So I think I would say that China is more desperate to work with the U.S. to prevent the U.S. from erecting more barriers for its exports, rather than the U.S. Basically trying to work out a deal with China. I don't think China can really hold out much longer. I think sooner or later, either this year or next year, we might start to see a serious problem in the Chinese economy, which would further weaken China's position.
All right. Thank you very much for your insights. We'll wait and see the meeting result, I guess. So hopefully next time when a new development, we'll catch up again.
Sure.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.